Tonight, something is happening inside the Russian state that has blindsided Washington in a way few analysts expected. For months, U.S. intelligence officials believed they understood Russia's trajectory, its military weaknesses, its internal fractures, its diplomatic isolation. But over the past several weeks, Russia has quietly executed a strategic shift so significant, so fast, and so completely outside the predicted playbook that it has triggered what can only be described as a full-spectrum alert across the U.S. national security establishment. This isn't a tactical adjustment. It isn't a new weapons test. It isn't even about a breakthrough in Ukraine. What Russia has unveiled is an entirely new strategic posture, global, multi-layered, and deliberately engineered to exploit America's blind spots. And tonight, for the first time, we have a clear picture of why Washington is rattled. Because the strategy Russia is now deploying does not rely on winning a conventional war. It does not rely on matching U.S. power or outspending NATO or overtaking Western alliances. It relies on overturning the assumptions that have guided U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Russia has realized something that American policymakers long believed was impossible, that the United States, despite its immense power, is stretched, thin, politically fragmented, and strategically vulnerable in ways unseen since the early 1990s. And Moscow's new strategy is designed to exploit those vulnerabilities from every possible angle and do it faster than the United States can adapt. Washington thought Russia would fight the old way: heavy armor, slow mobilization, predictable alliances, defensive posturing. Instead, Russia has launched a new model: leaner, more agile, more internationally networked, and far more unpredictable. This shift is what has shocked U.S. intelligence. The United States miscalculated. It assumed Russia would remain reactive and constrained. But Russia is now playing offense, not in Ukraine, but across the global system. The first hints came from places the United States wasn't even watching closely. A sudden spike in Russian diplomatic activity in regions where Moscow had been largely absent for decades. A series of military agreements that appeared meaningless in isolation, but together formed a web of influence Washington did not anticipate. Russian intelligence operatives showing up in Latin America. Russian financial networks linking with states under Western sanctions, new energy partnerships forged with countries long considered outside Russia's orbit. Each move seemed small on its own, but when U.S. analysts finally connected the dots, the picture was alarming. Russia was building a global network that could challenge the United States asymmetrically across multiple continents. The U.S. strategic community has been so focused on Russia's performance in Ukraine that it overlooked how quickly Russia was repositioning itself elsewhere. And that is where the shock comes in, because Washington's greatest fear has never been Russia's military. It has been Russia's ability to undermine American influence without firing a shot. And that is exactly the strategy Russia is now embracing. American officials speaking privately have described Russia's new posture as distributed disruption. That term might sound academic, but what it really means is simple. Russia is no longer trying to match American strength. It is trying to stretch American weakness. Instead of focusing on one battlefield, it is opening several. Instead of confronting U.S. power head-on, it is creating pressure points far from the reach of American oversight. Instead of relying on traditional alliances, it is partnering with states that Washington underestimated, ignored, or assumed would never align with Moscow. This is the part that most concerns the Biden administration. Russia's strategy is built on the assumption that the United States cannot effectively manage crises in multiple regions at once. And for the first time in decades, that assumption is not wrong. The Pentagon's global posture is already strained. European security requires massive commitments. The Middle East is unstable. US-China tensions are escalating. Domestic politics are paralyzing decision-making, and Russia has sensed weakness. It has sensed division. It has sensed hesitation, and it is acting before Washington can regain strategic focus. Under Putin's new strategy, Russia is leveraging several asymmetric tools, covert intelligence partnerships, cyber sabotage capabilities, economic alliances that bypass sanctions, and military deployments in regions the United States assumed were untouchable. And perhaps the most important, political influence networks that shape global narratives and shift international sentiment in Russia's favor. These tools are not conventional, but that is the point. Russia is no longer fighting a 20th century struggle. It is waging a 21st century one. Inside the White House, this realization hit like a shockwave. For weeks, U.S. analysts tried to explain Russia's sudden global activity as desperation, as improvisation, as improvisational foreign policy. But when intelligence reports confirmed coordinated patterns, the mood changed entirely. According to sources close to the National Security Council, the United States is now treating Russia's new posture as a strategic breakout, a moment where Moscow has abandoned defensive containment and embraced global influence building with the same aggressiveness it once used in Eastern Europe. And the consequences are enormous because if Russia succeeds, even partially, the architecture of American global leadership will be tested in ways Washington is not prepared for. U.S. alliances depend on the perception of American dominance. But if Russia creates enough friction across different regions, that perception begins to erode. And once it erodes, alliances weaken, influence declines, power dissolves. This is precisely why America is on high alert. Russia has seized the strategic initiative, and Washington is scrambling to catch up. What alarms U.S. planners is not Russia's strength, it is Russia's unpredictability. For years, American strategy has been built on the assumption that Russia would behave rationally, predictably, linearly, but now Russia is acting like a power that has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by destabilizing the status quo. And that is the greatest fear in Washington, unpredictability combined with capability. Russia may not be as wealthy as the United States, it may not have the same alliances, but it has strategic clarity, a clarity Washington has lacked for years, and clarity combined with aggression is a force multiplier. What comes next is part of the story the world is not ready for. To understand why Washington is shaken by Russia's new strategy, we need to look at the second layer of Moscow's repositioning, what U.S. analysts now call strategic displacement. Russia has begun using its limited but potent resources to displace American influence in areas the United States has long treated as strategically secondary: Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, the Middle East, even segments of Southeast Asia. And while Washington considered these regions peripheral, Russia recognized them as opportunities, low-cost, high-impact zones where American presence had weakened, where governance was fragile, and where anti-U.S. sentiment was already simmering. The genius of Russia's new approach is that it doesn't rely on overwhelming force. It relies on being the right partner at the right moment in places where the United States is no longer fully welcome. In parts of Africa, Russian security contractors now guard presidents, train militaries, and secure mining operations with resources Washington simply cannot mobilize without triggering congressional delays and global criticism. In Latin America, Russian intelligence services are opening back-channel channels that undermine U.S. diplomatic leverage. In the Middle East, Moscow is presenting itself as a stabilizing alternative to Western unpredictability, leveraging the fact that several U.S. partners increasingly distrust Washington's long-term commitment. And in Central Asia, a region the United States barely monitors, Russian influence has resurged quietly but steadily. Each move expands Russia's reach, but more importantly, each move shrinks America's. This is why the United States is now experiencing something rare, strategic surprise. For years, Washington expected Russia to collapse under sanctions, to weaken under military pressure, to fragment under economic isolation. Instead, Russia adapted faster than the U.S. anticipated. It rewired its economy with the help of Asia. It built shadow banking networks to bypass Western controls. It restructured supply chains. It redirected energy flows. And while the West believed Russia would be crippled, Moscow built new systems that were more resilient, more flexible, and more immune to U.S. leverage than the ones that existed before the war. Now, Russia is leveraging these adaptations on the global stage, and Washington, for the first time in decades, is reacting from behind. The Biden administration is quietly acknowledging what many observers long suspected. Russia's power was never just in its economy or its military numbers. It was in its ability to see the international system differently. Russia sees the world not as a network of alliances and institutions, but as a battlefield of influence, pressure, and opportunity. And that different worldview allows Moscow to target gaps in the U.S. system with remarkable efficiency. One of those gaps is the United States' inability to maintain focus across multiple regions. American strategy is stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. Domestic political division makes long-term planning difficult. And American power, while immense, is not infinite. Russia's new strategy exploits this limitation ruthlessly. Instead of concentrating its efforts, Moscow multiplies them, forcing the United States to defend its interests everywhere at once. And this is where Russia's new global network becomes dangerous. It doesn't need to defeat the United States in any single region. It only needs to force Washington to fight on too many fronts simultaneously. The shock within the Pentagon comes not from fear of Russian military might, but from the recognition that Russia is attempting something strategically sophisticated, shifting from a regional challenger to a global disruptor. For decades, American defense planning has treated Russia as a geographically contained power whose ambitions were primarily limited to Eastern Europe. But Russia's new strategy rejects that limitation. It seeks to expand horizontally, not by conquering territory, but by shifting influence in ways that create leverage for Moscow and vulnerability for Washington. This horizontal expansion is already showing signs of success. Russia is securing long-term agreements with countries desperate for alternatives to Western financial systems. It is gaining intelligence access to regions where U.S. surveillance is weak. It is building military partnerships that give Moscow airspace, ports, and logistical hubs that could one day support far more significant operations. And this expansion comes with minimal cost. While America spends billions maintaining bases around the world, Russia spends comparatively little building political footholds that deliver outsized geopolitical returns. The White House is now grappling with the uncomfortable reality that Russia has moved from isolation to reintegration into a different world, one not led by the United States. And Washington must now confront the possibility that it has misread Russia's long-term strategic intentions. Russia is not trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. It is not trying to dominate Europe. It is not trying to match America tank for tank or missile for missile. It is trying to reshape the international system in ways that erode American power and enhance Russia's importance. And in that context, Russia's new strategy is not surprising at all. It is an adaptation, a survival mechanism, a strategic counterattack. And Washington is realizing that it has underestimated just how capable Russia is at reinventing its geopolitical approach under pressure. The United States assumed Russia would remain stuck in old patterns. Instead, Russia broke those patterns and created new ones that the U.S. struggled to predict. Europe sees the danger too, not because Europe fears Russian domination of the world, but because Europe fears a world where American leadership is diluted. If the U.S. becomes overstretched, if American focus fractures across too many regions, Europe loses its anchor. NATO loses its backbone. Russia knows this, and Russia is exploiting it. Every new relationship Russia builds outside Europe weakens American cohesion inside Europe. Every new alliance Russia forms outside NATO's view expands Moscow's leverage inside the NATO system. Ukraine sits at the center of all of this, not because it is the ultimate objective, but because it is the battleground where Russia and the West measure each other's strength. Russia's goal is not simply victory in Ukraine, it is to demonstrate that the West cannot overpower it, isolate it, or contain it. And by launching a new global strategy, Russia is shifting the contest from one battlefield to many, forcing the U.S. to rethink not only its Ukraine policy, but its entire global posture. In Washington, intelligence officials now admit privately that they are facing a Russia that behaves nothing like the Russia they planned for. This Russia is global, agile, and increasingly unpredictable. It is using its limited tools with maximum efficiency, and it is shaping events faster than the United States can process them. That is the real shock in Washington, the recognition that Russia is playing a different strategic game, one designed not for rapid victories, but for slow, steady structural disruption. Tonight, America is on high alert, not because Russia is stronger, but because Russia is smarter in how it wields its strength. The global landscape is changing, the rules are shifting, and Russia has just shown that it intends to shape those rules, not follow them. This confrontation is no longer about tanks, missiles, or territory. It is about influence, positioning, and the future architecture of global power. And Washington now understands that Russia's new strategy is not a temporary tactic. It is the opening phase of a much larger geopolitical campaign.